Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 21st chapter in the book of Matthew. Now, in the preceding chapter, the 20th chapter, the first 16 verses consist of the parable of a vineyard owner who hires different employees to work his vineyard, and at the end of the day, he pays those who are there from the early morning to those who had just arrived in the last hour the same wage, a denarii, and a lot of the earlier workers protest, and he says, "This is not right for me to do with my wages as I wish." And then he concludes, that thus the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Many shall be called, but few are chosen. So a lot of people, they get saved at an early age, but it is never too late. But why wait? So if you are 80 years old, it's not too late to respond to salvation. Now, the part we're going to review in greater detail is the second half of the 20th verse. This is at one point immediately after he takes the 12 disciples aside and tells them flat out, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered up to the chief priest and to the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to flog and to impale. And the third day he shall rise again." Everything he just predicted is executed to the T. They are en route to Jerusalem. They finally arrive there in the 21st chapter. We're going to read of that. And at the end of the week, he enters with acclaim and praise and welcome. They greet him as a king and the Messiah. But at the end of the week, the high priest and the scribes, they turn the crowd against him as a blasphemer. And they ultimately indict him and execute him and deliver him to the Romans, because capital punishment as a subject people, they had to do it they could not take capital punishment into their own hands. They had to convince the Gentiles, and the Roman governor of the region, Pontius Pilate, reluctantly consents, but all things he was mocked, flogged, spit on, and crucified, and then on the third day he shall be raised. Now, this is neither the first nor the last time that he divulges this information to the disciples, and a lot of times they resist it, such as in the 16th chapter when Peter cannot compute that the Messiah must suffer. Other times it goes over their heads, but there's a curious absence of their response. So the most plausible inference is that it just went in one ear and out the other, because the next thing we know, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, those are John and James, two of the three of the inner entourage of the disciples, asked that his sons be seated at the right hand and the left hand of him in the reign. Verse 22, "But Yeshua answered, said, You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink, and to be baptized with the baptized that I am immersed with?" They said to him, "We are able." They said that because they had no idea what he was talking about. The cup was the cup of Gethsemane. "If it be possible, take this cup away." A cup is medicine, and the paradox is that through his suffering and agony, there is life and wholeness and spiritual health brought through. But he's talking about the baptism of blood, baptism of crucifixion, not baptism of water or anything else. And he said to them, "You shall indeed drink my cup, and you shall be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." So he assures them that inasmuch as he would be martyred, so too would they. Now, there is a difference between a martyrdom and the atonement. The atonement is sufficient and competent to procure our salvation. Martyrs die as witnesses to the faith. That secures their salvation, but it doesn't secure anyone else. And all 11 would die prematurely, including Judas, who did not die a martyr's death. He hung himself in suicide when he was flooded with remorse for his betrayal. He ended up killing himself before the Messiah was actually executed in the 27th chapter of this book. But John alone escaped the martyr's fate. He died alone and in the company of those who loved, although at one point he was poured into a pot of boiling water, and yet he miraculously survived. But as to the question of who sits in the intimate proximity at him, who is at the right hand of the throne of his Father, that is not for him to decide. He says it's for my Father alone, and I am not authorized to usurp that authority. And then there's this argument about them, when the other 10 disciples find out that the sons of Zebedee, James and John, are petitioning him for this permission. They get angry, and then he rebukes them, saying, you do not know what spirit you are. You have the spirit of the Gentiles. They aspire and seek for the greatest place at the table, but for you it is not to be so. And whoever wants to be first among you, let him be your servant. This ties into the 16th verse at the conclusion of the parable of the vineyard. Thus the first shall be last, and the first shall be last. So the paradox of Christian ministry is that as the world measures leadership, it is how many people you have serving under you. Church leadership is how many you serve. Even as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So his reason in his coming to earth was salvation, not judgment. Now in the 21st chapter, we read 2 issues of judgment. This is almost uncharacteristic of his mortal ministry, but he does issue judgment on the temple and on the fig tree. We will definitely get up to the temple. We don't know if we'll have enough time to get to the fig tree today, but the point is that he did not come to be served, but to serve others, and the entire reason that he came into the earth was to die for the sins and procure the salvation. And then when they're leaving Jericho, this is the city that we find him in Luke's 19th chapter, the first 10 verses, and then in Luke's 19th chapter he enters into Jerusalem. While there are 2 blind men, and in other accounts we know him as blind Bartimaeus, and they're asking for mercy. They address him as the son of David, and he asks them, what do you want me to do? And of course their request is that their eyes may be opened, that they may have sight. And having been moved with compassion, Yahshua touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. So compassion is the motivation and incentive for the performance of a lot of his miracles, no more than a physician could overlook a sick soul without lending his healing touch and hand. Could the Messiah overlook one who was demon-possessed or sin or in sickness or anything else? He is master both of the spirit and matter. So he touches their eyes, and just instantaneously they have a new lease on life. They have new sight, new mind, and they follow him. Now that does not mean that they follow him to Jerusalem. It only means that they are henceforth committed disciples to the one who... Now the first verse of the 21st chapter, lesson itself. And when they came near to Jerusalem and came to Bethpage, at the Mount of Olives, then Yahshua sent 2 disciples. They would have been the master and the 12, and they came near to Jerusalem. This is their headed destination. They are there for the Passover in the 3rd and final year of his mortal ministry. And the location of Bethpage is referenced only here in the New Testament. We don't read of it anywhere in the Old Testament, but the Talmud, the Jewish commentary on the law, mentions it as in close proximity to Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives would have been to the east of Jerusalem. It would have been 2,700 feet in height, just over 200 feet above Mount Zion, the hill upon which the temple was constructed. And the 2 disciples, I don't believe we know who they are, but it may have been Peter and John. These were, or James. These are the 3 most trusted. These are the inner entourage of the 12. Saying to them, go into the village opposite you, and straightway you shall find a donkey tied and a colt with her, and loosen, and bring them to me. So he's telling them where to go and what to do. Now, in Matthew's account, there are 2 animals, the donkey and the mother. That would have been the colt, much in the same way that the demon-possessed man in the 8th chapter near the out the Gentile side of the lake of the Sea of Galilee. The demon possessed man who is known as Legion. In in Mark and Luke's account, there is just one, but in his there is two, and in Mark's account there is only one animal, and I believe in Luke's as well, but for whatever reason there are two here, the donkey and its mother, and he has instructed them where to find them and what to do with them. Bring them to me. And if anyone says whatever to you, you shall say, the master needs them, and immediately he shall send them. So whoever owned these animals would have been alarmed at someone taking something that doesn't belong to them. But once they have the assurance that it is the Master, the Messiah, who needs them, then all doubts, reservations, and protestations will instantly quash. And it happens just as they fold. The Master needs them. He needed them to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah, of which Zechariah 9:9, of which we will soon read. And all this took place that it might be filled that was spoken by the prophet, saying, that prophet would have been Zechariah. Now, of the minor prophets, the only one that Yahshua mentions by name is Jonah, the sign of Jonah, in Matthew 16:4 and 12, the 12th chapter, and also Luke's 11th chapter. But he does also quote Hosea in the 9th chapter and other minor prophets throughout. He mentions Isaiah by name, Jeremiah by name, and the abomination of the desolation of Daniel. I don't believe he ever references Ezekiel, who was a major prophet by name, or even referenced him. But this can be located in Zechariah 9:9, of which we soon read. Say to the daughter of Zion, see, your king is coming to you, meek and sitting on a donkey, even a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, donkeys are not the most majestic physical specimens, but they are in fact attributed to royalty. We can read of this in the first book of Samuel. This would have been the transportation. This would have been the transporting animal of both Saul and David. And the king is coming to you, and he is meek. He is not, meekness is the quality. Meekness is not weakness. It is power under control. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We read of in the Sermon of the Beatitude. And he's sitting on the donkey and a colt, the foal of a donkey. So once more, there are two animals. And the disciples went, and having done as Yahshua ordered them, they brought the donkey and the colt, and laid their garments on them, and he sat on them. So there is no resistance from the owner of the animals, although it is implied and assumed that they would have been returned upon having completed the purpose for which they were extracted and temporarily borrowed. He didn't steal them. And they laid the garments on them. So he wouldn't have been riding bareback. He would have had appropriately attired, something to the effect of regal splendor, on the animal's back, and he would have sat on them, and he would have moved on them, and he would have been entered into the city in that fashion. And most of the crowd spread their garments on the way, while others cut down branches from the trees and spread them along the way. Cut down branches from the trees. This is Palm Sunday. This is the day when the denizens of Jerusalem welcome the Messiah, their king, who came on a donkey, by waving palms. And they're also quoting Psalm 118:25 in the next verse, but they're also spreading their garments to pave the path and make the way. Now, whenever royalty went anywhere, he would have been preceded by a party who would have paved the way and prepared the path. This is the relationship of John the Baptist to the one he came to point to and to proclaim. And so this is how he enters into the city. He enters in triumphantly, but as he predicted in the 20th chapter, he will be crucified, mocked at, spit on, arrested, indicted, and then turned over to the mercy of the Romans, the Gentiles, who would execute him on the cross, surrounded by two other malefactors. And the crowds who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he coming in the name of Yahweh! Hosanna in the highest! So these are greetings of acclaim and welcome. There are those who are going before him. There are those who are paving the way. There are those who are following him. Those who, so wherever he goes, there are people in front of him and people behind him, and they're all saying the same thing. They're quoting Psalm 118:25, and they recognize him as the son of David. He was a biological descendant of David. This much is documented in both the genealogies of Matthew's first chapter and Luke's third chapter. Mary was a descendant of David's son Nathan, whereas Joseph was a descendant of Solomon, David's royal heir. But he is the son of David. This would have been a messianic title, and this is the same thing that the two blind people in the 20th chapter address him on. Have compassion on us, O Master, son of David. So they recognize who it is, who they are talking to. They treat him with all due deference and respect. And as he entered into Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, Who is this? So there is a mystery, there's excitement and clamor, and just people are over the top. You know, there's something significant going on, but there's also a mysterious element amongst much of the people who are not part of the proceeding. They want to know, who is this? You know, first off, it's a man on a donkey, and that is not the way financially prestigious people rode. They would have had a horse and a chariot, and they would have been surrounded by a liege of people. So they want to know, who is this? Why are they greeting him as they are? Is this the last thing they probably expect is that this is the long expected and anticipated Messiah and King. And the crowd said, This is Yahshua, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. Nazareth was where he was born and raised. This was his hometown. This is where he spent the first 30 years of his life in quiet anonymity and obscurity as a carpenter's son. And when he returns there in the first year of his ministry in Luke's fourth chapter, he applies a prophecy he's reading in the synagogue immediately after being baptized and tempted. He's reading from a scroll from Isaiah 61:1 and applies it to himself. And then he says that the ministry of Elisha and Elijah were to Gentiles, and that his own people would be rejected, and they reject him. They drive him to the edge of a cliff, but his time had not yet come, so they were powerless to push him off the edge of the cliff, but they got him at least that far. And then the second time when he returns in Mark's 6th chapter, and I think, Matthew's 13th chapter, they don't try and kill him. They just refuse to take him seriously. They say, is this not the carpenter's son? Is this not Joseph's son? Is his mother not Mary? They list all his brothers by name and his sisters, not by name. But he did, they saw him as a human term, but others, a prophet is not received in honor, is not appreciated in his own country. So he went all throughout the region of Galilee and also in Samaria, in John's account, and Judah, and especially John's account, and also the synoptics follow the trajectory of his Galilean ministry, leading and culminating in his final week in Jerusalem. So wherever he went outside of Nazareth, he wasn't universally acclaimed. There was controversy all about him. He was doing and saying these things, the likes of which no one had ever seen or heard or had ever been experienced. But the question of the crowd, the mystery is alleviated. This is his name, and he is a prophet, but he's also more than a prophet. He is the prophet as predicted by Moses in Deuteronomy 18:15. This is applied to him throughout the books of Acts, the 3rd chapter, and a few other places. And Joshua went into the temple of Elohim, and drove out all those buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the table of the money changer, and the seats of those who sold doves. So he enters into the temple of his fathers. This is his father's personal possession, and he is livid to see that the men of Mammon had set up shop. They had turned it into a lucrative enterprise. Now, since the diaspora, Jews from all over the Roman Empire in the east and even to the west, and not so much the north and south, but all over the place, they would have came and bought these sacrificial animals at exchange rates. They had a monopoly. There was no other option to buy these animals, and it become a lucrative process. And I believe that Annas, who was the high priest before Caiaphas, who was the reigning high priest, he was in charge of the enterprise of buying and selling and just making a lucrative killing. And there were money changers who exchanged. Now, the temple currency, they had its own currency according to which one could purchase the sacrificial animals, and the inflation rates were sky high. So they made they were corrupting a house of worship into a house of merchandise. Ye cannot serve Elohim and Mammon. And they sold the doves. These were sacrificial animals. But Joshua enters into and violently overturns the table. He uses physical force. And in John's account, he does this in the first chapter, and he's driving them out with a whip. So he means business. And this is uncharacteristic of him, because as we read in John 3:17 and in Luke 9:56, the Son of Man came to save, not to judge the earth, but here is a rare instance of judgment. He is taking it personally. This is his father's temple, and he does not like the abuse or the apostasy or the corruption that has set in its foot, and he's determined to do something about it. The synoptics place this in the third and final year of his ministry. John places it at the first. There is no contradiction. He did both. And he said to them, It has been written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers. This is a citation of Jeremiah 7:11, I think, but in Mark's account he also combines Isaiah 56:7. But this house was to be a house of prayer, a house of worship, a house of fellowship, a house where Elohim, his father, Yahweh, could receive his due deference and, to be praying. But to turn it into a den of robbers and a den of thieves, this is in violation of one of the commandments. And, if money is your God, then you are in violation of not only the commandment of stealing. So they were extracting more than what was necessary. They were making a killing and a profit, and were quite lucrative in ripping people off. They didn't have a choice because they had a monopoly, but this was defeating the purpose and missing the point for which the temple had been constructed and for what it was designed to be, a house of prayer, not one of commerce and merchandise. And blind and lame ones came to him in the temple, and he healed them. So wherever there are blind ones and lame ones and physically and spiritually handicapped people, whether demon-possessed or sick or maimed or anything else, they come to him and they receive the healing they need that he can uniquely provide. So healing is an aspect of his ministry, and of course these people are in his corner, but there's always a division, there's always a controversy. He is never universally acclaimed or popular, because as we read in the next verse, But when the chief priest and scribes saw the wonders which he and the children crying out in the temple, and saying, Hosanna to the Son of Man, they were greatly displeased. Now they were displeased because he was a threat to their status quo. They knew that the crowd was in his corner, the crowd in the temple, the crowd outside the temple, the crowd in the streets of Jerusalem. They were acclaiming and receiving this man as the long-anticipated Messiah. This did not escape notice. So what's curious is that there's no mention of his activity in the temple, this attracting their negative attention or anything else. And but they were greatly displeased because this was the man they were determined to kill. And by the end of the week, this is early in the final week of his life, but by the end of the week, they will turn the crowd against him. Now, prior to this point, there was always a division wherever he went. The crowds and the audiences in the synagogue would have been amazed and astonished, but the religious rulers who were nitpicking over their rules and regulations would have made their protestations known. But here the crowd loves him, but eventually the high priest, the chief priests, and the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees turn the crowd against him, convince them that he is a blasphemer and worthy of death, and they convince the Romans that he called himself king, which would have been sedition and treason, and said to him, "Do you hear what these say?" And Yahshua said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of children and nursings you have perfected praise?" So he's quoting Psalm 8:2. He is the son of David. He uses the words of David as penned in the 8th Psalm to answer their question. And of course he hears what they say, and he references a scripture to rest his case, because these men were unlearned. They were learned in the scriptures, but they curiously they nitpicked, they cherry picked, they missed the main message. They were stuck on the minutia and the lesser matters, but they neglected the weightier matters of mercy, charity, and alms, and they were determined to trap him for violating this, for healing on the Sabbath and stuff like that. So he always appeals to the higher principle, and he is the Word, and as such he is intimately acquainted with the Word. The Word is more extensive than the Bible alone. It is also the divine personification of the Son. And having left them, he went to the city of Bethany and spent the night there. Bethany is the place where he is anointed in oil in John 10:6. It is in proximate location. It would have been a suburb of Jerusalem. It would have been in the vicinity. So he accomplished what he went into that city. He's going to return there for the night, but he's not far away. He's staying in the vicinity. His work in Jerusalem is not done. And as when he returns to the temple, first off, while there, we don't have time to get into it today, but he curses a fig tree, and then he defends his claim for authority and then he delivers the parable of the vineyard owner, which is a negative report card of the nation of Israel's abominable history of killing the prophets, the servants of Elohim, whom he had sent to them, and they were going to kill his son, which happened by the end of the week. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.